Welcome back. We are continuing day 12. So now the Chafetz Chaim on C5 will talk about the general prohibition, how a person who speaks Lashon Hara violates the general prohibition against being arrogant. ועובר נמי המספר לשון הרע בלאו דאישר לך פן תשכח את השם אלוקיך. One who speaks Lashon Hara also transgresses the prohibition, take heed lest you forget Hashem your God. This is in Sefer Dvarim, chapter 8, Pasuk 11. Shechu azara legasei haruach. This is a warning to arrogant people not to exhibit such behavior. Now the Torah writes in Pasuk 14, 3 verses later, your heart will become haughty and you will forget Hashem. So that verse demonstrates that arrogance causes one to forget Hashem. So if we look back at this verse, which says, take heed lest you forget Hashem, it's understood as a commandment not to be arrogant. And as the Chafetz Chaim will explain, Lashon Hara results out of arrogance. Now it's important to note that, it's interesting to note that the Rambam, Maimonides, does not include this in his count of negative commandments. However, the Smag, Sefer Mitzvah Gadol, written by Rabbi Moses of Joseph of Kuli, negative commandment 64, does, and in his introduction, it's just interesting to know that in his introduction he initially wrote that he did not intend to include this prohibition. However, he had a revelation in a dream in which he was told, you have forgotten the fundamental principle of take heed lest you forget Hashem your God. This verse that the Chafetz Chaim just cited. So he concludes, in the morning I contemplated the matter, and I realized that this pasuk, this prohibition, is in fact fundamental principle of Yirat Hashem, and I therefore included it in my Sefer HaMitzvot. And the Chafetz Chaim continues, Ki kevan shehu mal'ig umitlotzetz al chavero, for since the speaker is ridiculing and mocking his fellow Jews, mistama hu machshiv et atzmo lechacham leish be'anashim, he presumably regards himself as being a wise person, a man among men. And this means that he's superior to other people. Ki elu haya makir et nigei atzmo. This is self-evident because one who recognizes his own flaws, lo haya mal'iga mechavero, would not ridicule his fellow by reporting his fellow's flaws. Right? It makes sense that if a person truly understood how much flaws he has, he would not ridicule anyone. And furthermore, if you were to understand that if you were in that person's shoes, you would not only do the sin that the same mistake that he would, you would probably make an even bigger mistake. But anyways, that is beside the point. And because the footnote here says that it may be that for this reason the punishment of tzarat, which is associated with Lashon Hara, right? We learned this in the previous day, that the prohibition of getting tzarat means that one has to distance himself from Lashon Hara. And according to this, Lashon Hara is also associated with arrogance. That means tzarat is associated with arrogance. And indeed, we find that the purification process for the mitzorah, the person who had incurred tzarat, his purification process involves a stick from a tall cedar, which symbolizes haughtiness, arrogance, and a crimson thread and hyssop, which symbolizes humility. And this is what Rashi comments to the verse in Vayikra, chapter 14, verse 4. And so the Chafetz Chaim continues. Having mentioned the sin of arrogance, the Chafetz Chaim expounds on its severity, the severity of arrogance. There's a well-known statement of our sages of blessed memory in Tractate Sota, Daf 4b, expressing that the effect of sin of arrogance is very severe, as it is stated there in Masechet Sotah, she'avur zeh, as a result of a person's arrogance, ein afron nin'ar litchiat metim, his remains will not come to life at the resurrection of the dead. He is like a worshipper of idols and constellations. And the Shechina wails over him. And he is called an abomination. And see the Gemara there for further elaboration. And the Gemara there says that, although yes, this sounds very, very scary, one should not be dismayed that one can do tshuva, and one will not incur these punishments if one does tshuva for his arrogance. Because arrogance is a very, very bad character trait that everyone has to work on and do tshuva for. So speaking lashon hara out of arrogance is particularly sinful, right? Arrogance in and of itself is sinful, but speaking lashon hara out of arrogance, im b'sipur hazeh shel kalon kelon chavero hu mechabed et atzmo. If someone glorifies himself through speaking disparagingly about his fellow, bevadai oved belav zeh, in such a case, the speaker certainly violates this prohibition against being arrogant. מלבד מה שקראתוהו רבותינו זכרנו לברכה ברוח קדשה מעולם הבא. In addition to this, the rabbis, with their divine inspiration, severed him from his share in the world to come. V'amru, as they said in the Talmud Yerushalmi to Masechet Chagiga, chapter 2, Mishnah 1. ומתכבד בקלון חברו אין לו חלק לעולם הבא. A person who glorifies himself through the degradation of his fellow has no share in the world to come. And the Be'er Maim Chaim adds that this applies only if the person you are degrading is present. If he's not present, this excommunication from the world to come, share in the world to come, does not apply. However, the Rambam writes that one forfeits his portion of the world to come only if he habitually glorifies himself by degrading others, if one does a habit out of this. Okay, so that is Seif 5. And now we're moving on to the next prohibition. So someone who speaks or accepts lashon hara desecrates Hashem's name. ועובר נעמי המספר המקבל בלאו דלא תתחלל את שם קדשי. A person who speaks or accepts lashon hara also transgresses the prohibition, do not desecrate my holy name. This is in Sefer Vayikra, chapter 22, verse 32. And the Chafetz Chaim, in his Be'er Maim Chaim, elaborates he elaborates on the severity of Chilul Hashem, even if one doesn't do it publicly. The Rambam writes in Hilchot Tshuva that Tshuva, Yom Kippur, and sufferings, tzarot, do not atone for the sin of Chilul Hashem. And the only way to that it comes through it only comes to atonement through death. However, moreover, the Mishnah in Masechet Avot says that someone who commits a Chilul Hashem even inadvertently, by accident, is also subject to punishment. And the Sharei Tshuva writes, however, that one can do tshuva for the sin. And how does one do this? So, if he does a Kiddush Hashem, if one were to sanctify Hashem's name, sanctify Hashem's Torah before people and inform him of Hashem's power, his iniquity is removed in proportion to the effect of his glorification of Hashem's name. So obviously it's in proportion. So if one desecrated Hashem's name a lot, in order to do tshuva, you have to sanctify Hashem's name a lot. And obviously that you can't. Anyways. So because he presumably commits the sin not out of ordinary physical desire, right? The sin of lashon hara. But because of a blatant disregard for Torah's commandments and the honor of Hashem, since there's no physical bodily desire to engage in lashon hara, and there's no physical benefit gained from it, It emerges that the ordinary means through which the Yetzer Hara generally prevails over a person and causes them to sin, i.e., physical desires, do not apply to the sin. Right? Usually, a person sins out of his bodily lusts and bodily desires. ועל כן נחשב עוון הזה כמרד ופריקת על מלכות שמיים ועלמא. And having no physical urge to engage in Lashon Hara, one who engages in the sin is therefore viewed as though he is committing a blatant act of rebellion against Hashem, and as though he is casting off the yoke of heaven. Thus a person who desecrates Hashem's name with this, engaging in Lashon Hara. Now, it's interesting to note that when the Chazon Ish read these words, he remarked, that evidently the Chafetz Chaim never tasted the pleasure of speaking Lashon Hara. And indeed, the Chafetz Chaim does write in his book Shefer Shmirat Lashon that one does receive pleasure from speaking Lashon Hara, even though there's no physical benefit. And that is because unlike, for example, the desire to eat not kosher food, Lashon Hara does not provide bodily pleasure. Thus, the desire to speak Lashon Hara does not originate from the physical world, but from tamei sources in the spiritual world. So, according to this, the Chilul Hashem may be thus that the Lashon Hara speaker is choosing the tamei forces over the forces of Kedusha. And it's important also to note that the Chelkat Binyamin, a commentary on the Rambam, notes that from the Rambam's language, right, that when he talks about the sin of Chilul Hashem, it implies that Chilul Hashem exists only when actions are motivated as a rebellion to cast away the yoke of kingdom of heaven. And according to this explanation, if one does not have that intent of rebellion against Hashem, then one evidently does not violate Chilul Hashem. But that is one explanation out of a myriad of other explanations. So the Chafetz Chaim finishes off. This Chilul Hashem applies even regarding a person who is an average Jew. But it is especially applicable if the person is a distinguished person, whose actions are examined by all, who unquestionably desecrates Hashem's names by engaging in Lashon Hara. And how much more so is this the case if this transgression was committed publicly. For the sin is certainly so much more severe, in that the person is deemed one who desecrates Hashem's name publicly. Okay, so that is the end of today. Thank you for listening, and we will continue B'ezrat Hashem tomorrow.